I might go ahead and get started. I want to give you at least some idea before we do of how I intend to approach these lessons. I define for this series a bad example of the Bible as an example where somebody committed a sin that we can learn from. And the way I'll be looking at these is kind of in groups. I've grouped them sort of according to what I see as a common root cause. Now, sin sometimes has a lot of causes, but sometimes you can look at things and say, well, that was largely because a person wasn't willing to wait for something to happen on God's time frame, or that one was largely a result of somebody greed, or that was largely a result of somebody looking for the praise of men, or any number of things that where people commit sin for those causes. And what I want to do is look at several examples and discuss each of the examples in each one of those groups. And then as we get through the examples, have some time at the end to talk about what we can learn from them, what we need to look for in our own lives, how those things could lead us to sin, and maybe some ways to avoid that happening. And these are not going to necessarily end on class boundaries. The lessons I want to look at tonight are examples of people who sinned largely because, as I think of it, they listened to the wrong voices. A lot of times how we react in life and how things go for us in life depends on who we're willing to listen to or what sources of information we consider credible. Somebody who considers a false teacher as a very credible source of information is going to come up with a different idea of how you relate to God than somebody who considers a true teacher a very credible source of information. Somebody who considers the Bible a book of mythology is going to miss having a relationship with the God of the Bible unless that changes. So a lot has to do with who we believe, who we think is credible. And so the examples we'll be looking at tonight, and probably for the next, I would guess the next 2 or 3 lessons anyway, will be people who either listen to the wrong voices or fail to listen to the right voices. And I'll start out with, see if I can get this to, my luck is not always the best in the world with this. What? Okay. Matt, could you just go ahead and advance that? Okay. I want to start out kind of at the beginning with Adam and Eve. Genesis 3, and we'll read verses 1 through 7, which will be the next 2 slides there. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord had made. And he said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths." There are 3 types of voices in this example. There's God's voice, which is always the right voice to listen to. There's Satan's voice, which is always the wrong voice to listen to. And even though it doesn't mention that she said anything other than giving her husband the fruit, there's really a human voice involved. And a human voice can be either. Why do you think that Eve trusted Satan instead of God? What would have caused her to do that? What was that?
What he told the master of desire.
Okay. The comment was that what he said matched her desire. Anything else? Okay. Steve says the other thing was very convincing. The comment was that may have been something she wanted to do all along, and the devil just kind of gave her permission to do that. It kind of goes along with what Chuck was saying, that it matched her desire. I have down that Satan gave her a reason to desire the fruit, which he did. You know, it's the other thing that I have down. Let's go to James 1 verses 13 through 15 next. Kind of related to this, it says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death." So we've got a situation here where certainly after Satan had talked to her, she desired the fruit, and as a result, she committed the sin of eating it. The other thing that I had down is that Satan convinced her that God had ulterior motives in telling her not to eat that fruit. You know, Satan said, if you eat that fruit, you'll be as wise as God. You'll know good and evil. So Satan convinced her that God had ulterior motives and that he lied to her. And I'm guessing, I think it's likely that Adam or Eve, neither one at this point, had ever had anybody lie to them. I think this is probably their first encounter with that. God certainly wouldn't have lied to them. And my guess is if they'd lied to each other, that might have been considered the first sin. But this is the first time, maybe the first time that Eve or Adam, either one, had experienced somebody lying to them. The other thing I'll mention is that Satan is an excellent salesman for his product. He knows exactly how to create the desires that can lead us to sin. And he's also good at convincing us to disbelieve God or to question God's motives. That's certainly what he did in this case. And we'll probably get into this a little bit more in a later lesson, but how do we learn to trust God? In this case, Eve didn't, and Adam didn't. But how do we learn to trust God? Okay. She said, knowing, from His Word what He's promised and what He's done for those that did trust Him, it's kind of a matter of looking at His track record is one of the things that we can do. What about our life experiences? Are there things in our life experiences that can tell us that God is trustworthy? A lot of times, at least in my life, I can look at things that I did things the way that I knew God would want me to do it, but I thought, I don't know if this is going to work out well. And it may be a week later, 10 years later, half a lifetime later, that you realize that things, when you do them God's way, turn out better than you'd think they might. And you find out that things that when you go against God's will turn out worse than you would think that they might. One of the ways that we learn to trust, if I can talk here, one of the ways that we can learn to trust God's voice is by looking at His track record and by seeing what happens in our own lives when we do things His way as opposed to when we go our own way. Do you think Adam heard Satan's sales pitch? Do you think Adam heard Satan's sales pitch to Eve? If you look, and I'm not going to go back to it, but if you look at Genesis verse 6, it says, "She took of its fruit, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate." And so I don't know that he had been with her the whole time, but to me that kind of says that he may have heard that sales pitch too, and it may not necessarily just have been that she gave it to him and he ate. He may have been convinced that he wanted to do that anyway. But in either case, peer pressure can increase the temptation to sin. Even if Adam had heard what Satan had to say, if you're doing something in a group of people, if you're doing something wrong in a group of people that's doing wrong, it can increase the pressure on you to do what's wrong. But whatever the case, Satan knew exactly what it took to cause both of them to disobey God. And I mentioned earlier that God's voice, Satan's voice, and the human voice were involved in this temptation. Where Satan can, he will often bring his temptations either wholly or in part through a trusted human voice. Whether in Adam and Eve's case, it was just a matter of she said something to Adam or she just handed him the fruit. A lot of times, Satan's temptations will come through a voice we trust. And you can think of a number of examples in the Scripture. You think of Samson and Delilah. The way she found out the secret to his strength was, she just kept pestering him until he told her. Even people who are righteous, like Job, it got to a point, if you read through Job, where Job's wife told him, and I'm sure she was as struggling as much as Job was. Job's wife told him, said, "Curse God and die." I suspect that in general, she was a very God-fearing woman that had just kind of reached the end of a rope. I don't know that, but that would be my guess. But nevertheless, that temptation came through a voice that Job would normally listen to. You think of, even though he wasn't intending to try to tempt him, you think of Jesus telling Peter and all the rest of the apostles, "I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to be crucified and be in the ground for 3 days and then be raised from the dead." And Peter took Jesus aside and said, "Lord, this is never going to happen to you." And Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you don't have the things of God at heart, you have the things of men at heart." So in a lot of times, Satan's temptations can come through the voice of someone that we would normally listen to or someone that we would normally trust. Let's go to Numbers chapter 13, and I want to read 13:25 through 14:4, and that will be several slides here. At the end of 40 days, they returned from, and well, the context, and most of you will recognize this, is the Israelites had been told to take the promised land. And 12 spies had been sent in to spy out the land. They'd been in there for 40 days, and this was the report of the spies. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land, and they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told them, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan." But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Then the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are." So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who were from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept at night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Do you think the 10 spies were telling the people what they believed? I tend to think that they were. That there was genuine fear there. You think about it, though, they had seen, and these were leaders of the people that had gone to spy out the land. They had seen the plagues of Egypt. They had seen the sea dried up before them when the Egyptians were pursuing them, and they had the sea ahead of them, and they felt like they were hemmed in. They had seen God feed them manna, I think quail also by this point. They had seen water brought forth out of a rock, I think at this point. They had seen what God could do. And yet, these 10 spies were able to convince the people that they were not able to take the land, in spite of Moses and Caleb and Joshua, and by extension, since Moses was a spokesman for God, God saying, "Yeah, I'll be with you. Go in and take it." Why would they not believe them? I mean, why would they believe the 10 as opposed to believing God and believing Caleb and Joshua and Moses? Okay, that just said, the comment was, it seems to be human nature to believe the worst. Other comments?
Well, the spies weren't telling you anything false. They were, telling the truth that, these people were
The comment was that the spies were telling the truth. Those were large people. They were strong people. The cities were fortified. The spies were telling the truth. The issue was lack of faith, really, that they weren't trusting God to do what He promised He would do. There are two or three things that I want to mention here. One of them, obviously lack of faith. Following a crowd is another one. You had 10 people saying, no, we can't do it, and a couple of people saying that we can. Let's look at Exodus 23. It's just a couple of verses, 1 and 2. Commandment, you shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many so as to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. That business of not falling in with the many to do evil is, it's kind of human nature to want to do what everybody else is doing. Back when I was in college, if I remember correctly, I was told about a psychology experiment where they had slides, and maybe one of them had a large number of dots on it, and the other one had quite a bit fewer, but still similar pictures, but one of them with a lot more dots than the other one. And if you ask people to say which has got the most dots on it, they would immediately point to the right one. But if you put those people in a group and you seated the group and you ask a bunch of people which one's got the most dots in it, and everyone before somebody picked the one that had the fewest dots, then there was a good chance that when you ask a person who hadn't been seated or anything else which one's got the most the fewest dots or the most dots, they would pick the ones that the people before them had picked. Just kind of a tendency to want to do what everybody else is doing. And I see that passage in Exodus as being, there are a lot of examples, and we'll look at some of them through the course of the class, but where falling in with the many to do evil is a problem for people. And it can be a problem for us if we're not, if we're not aware of it. The other things, and some of this has been mentioned, fear can test the faith of even people with a strong faith and a good relationship with God. And I'd like to read Matthew chapter 26, verses 69 through 75. And you'll recognize this, but it says, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean. And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath, I do not know the man. And after a little while the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. If you look at Peter in the hours before that, he was absolutely confident that he would never leave Jesus or deny him. Christ said, you'll deny me 3 times, and and he said, if I have to die with you, I'll never deny you. And Peter, I'm sure in his own mind, meant that. If you look at that night, when Jesus was arrested, I believe it was Peter that took his sword and cut off the ear of the priest's servant. And I'm sure Peter wasn't aiming for the ear, that he took that sword and he was going after the neck, and the man ducked and it caught the ear. But Peter was prepared to die for Jesus. And Jesus said, "Put your sword away." And so the things that Peter thought he knew to do to defend Jesus, Jesus said, no. And I think it left Peter at a total loss. And when somebody's at a loss like that, and in a situation where they feel, highly threatened and no idea what to do, it's pretty easy sometimes, even where somebody has got a lot of faith, to sin, to do the wrong thing. And that was what Peter did in that case. Very strong faith, but a very strong fear.
Well, I think also too, so Jesus had just been arrested. He saw all the led up to that, but he also, the crowd was against Jesus and those who followed him at that point. And so I think the fear of, he was kind of backed in a corner, and that fear led him to that sin as well. He was very, he probably didn't have a sword anymore. He couldn't fight off everybody. So he was in a no-win situation, so to speak. And so that fear got the better of him, and therefore he denied Christ and sin.
The comment was that that fear was legitimate. Christ was on trial. He was about to be crucified. Probably the only reason that all of the disciples didn't get killed in all of that was when they were in the garden and they were arresting Jesus. Jesus asked who they wanted, and they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he basically said, "I am he. If you're looking for me, let these men go." And and all of them fled. But and that was to fulfill a prophecy that that not one of those you've given me would be lost, except the one that I've forgotten how it was stated, but the one that Judas, basically, the one that betrayed him. And so the fear was legitimate, but fear. Peter was utterly convinced that he'd die with Christ before he would deny him. And the fear was legitimate, but the faith and the strength was not as strong as Peter thought it was. And that can be true with any of us, yes.
Do you think that when he was with Jesus, personally, side by side, that he would feel stronger, that he was just far enough from Jesus to be less faithful and more afraid?
And that's true. The comment was that if he was side by side with Jesus, maybe he was more faithful, and when he wasn't with Jesus, that he was more afraid. And I think that's human nature, and I think that was true of Peter and true of everybody, that if somebody is around a strong leader that you've always looked up to and they've taken care of you, and he had seen Christ calm the storm, he had seen him raise the dead, he had seen all the things he could do, and all of a sudden he's not here anymore. Sometimes that business of going out on your own after you've been under the mentorship of someone else can be a little bit difficult to handle. One thing, and this is totally unrelated, but many years ago, for a few years, I flew an airplane some. There is a whole lot of difference in flying a plane with an instructor sitting right next to you And the first time you take a plane up, and you're it. And I think that's kind of where Peter was in this situation. He was having to deal with it on his own without having Christ to fall back against and say, okay, what do I do now? There's the other example that I wanted to look at in terms of what fear can do in terms of testing someone is 1 Kings 19, verses 1 through 4. And this was just after Elijah had had a contest with several hundred prophets of Baal. And it was the one where he was out on the mountain, and he said, okay, we'll see which God answers by fire. And you know, God made it clear who was God. And so this was immediately after that. So beginning with 1 Kings 19, 1 through 4, Ahab, who was the king, told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with a sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went away a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, it's enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I'm no better than my fathers. Elijah had done everything that God wanted him to do. He had provided a powerful demonstration to Ahab and to the Israelites of God's power and the fact that Baal didn't have that power. And yet he was threatened by the queen, and his reaction was, I'm a failure, you might as well take my life. You know, he was just ready to give up. And of course, you know, if you read on in this, then God does take care of him over the course of the next few chapters. And basically what he does is he says, get up, I've got these things for you to do. And he also corrects some misunderstandings that Elijah has about him being the only one. But be that as it may, fear can make even people with a strong faith, or cause even people with a strong faith to sin and to do things that they not only normally wouldn't do, but would be totally convinced that they would never do, as in Peter's case. The other thing, so one of the things when we look at the spies, the fact that they feared, I think, is one of the reasons that the people listened to the 10 spies. The other note that I had down here is that there can also be a really powerful emotional desire to do what the people around you are doing. And I want to look at just one example of that. And again, this is with somebody that is spiritually very strong, but Galatians 2, verses 11 through 14. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? So again, we see an example of a crowd leading a person with a very strong faith aside from what they know to be right. And the thing that is striking, and I think Paul intended for it to be striking to the people that knew, the people he was talking about, was it said even Barnabas was led astray. Barnabas was the encourager. He was the one that vouched for Paul, when everybody was saying, well, he used to go out and kill the Christians and put them in jail. Barnabas was the one that was the encourager. He was the one that related well with people. He was drawn away by that hypocrisy. So in the case of these people, the Israelites believing the 10 instead of God and the other 2 spies, I think we've got several things. I think fear was a major driver of it. I think the desire to kind of fall in with the crowd probably contributed to that. And see, I was thinking, lack of faith we've mentioned. I think were probably the 3 things that caused the Israelites at that time to listen to those 10 spies. This next one is really more of a puzzle to me than a lot of the others. Let's read Exodus 32, verses 1 through 3. And the situation here is that the Israelites are camped out around Mount Sinai. Moses is up on the mountain. He's been gone for 40 days or close to it. And this is what's going on in the camp. It says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what's become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early in the day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Aaron was a spokesperson for Moses from about the time of the burning bush. And, he had seen up close all the miracles that God had done for the Israelites leading up to the Exodus from Egypt. He'd seen the miracles involved in feeding and caring for them after they left. How could he let the people talk him into making a golden calf and lead in the offerings made to that calf? What's that?
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure. That is certainly a good part of it. He basically wanted to please the people. Yeah.
Okay. You just got that on. If you're almost told into that he makes half of it, and some of the text it puts it in all caps.
Yeah.
Just some clarity. We're going to make something, we'll mold it, and then to that these people, we'll still have our God over here, and it's a feasting. And I'll just make it all work out.
Well, the thing, if you look, the comment was that it talks about we'll have a feast to the Lord and all caps, which is the Yahweh that what the Hebrews would have would have called the Lord. To me, it's not real clear in my mind that Aaron understood all of the issues that God would have with an idol, or that he knew enough to know, necessarily what God would want. But if you look in the scriptures beyond this, it's really obvious that that God tells Moses they made a calf and they're worshiping it. And at least as I recall, that's the yeah. Yeah. Well,
Obvious there that, okay, it wasn't Catholic for us to see, it wasn't Catholic if, but back in this kind of world altogether.
I think I would have a little bit of trouble summarizing, but I think part of what Keith is saying basically is that Aaron didn't take things as seriously as God and Moses took them. God told Moses that go down because the people have rebelled, and if you read the passages following, God is ready to destroy the Israelites at that point. Bob?
Part of this might be connected to what you said about Peter too, when Christ was no longer with him. As you know, there was a period of time when Moses was up on the mountain. Aaron's just there, and they're all waiting. Nothing's happened for a long time, and all of a sudden he doesn't have Moses there to lean on, and he's been gone a long time. And so does that mean now that God's changed his mind, or what's going on? And you can see how he was more swayed by the crowd with the passage of time as being part of that, I think, too.
The comment was that with Moses gone for as long as he was, that Aaron probably always leaned on Moses for kind of like Peter would lean on Christ or something like that, that Moses was the spokesperson for God, and with Moses out of the picture for close to 40 days or close to 40 days, that he might have been kind of adrift, I guess, in a sense, that the rock that he had kind of relied on was no longer there, and so he did that.
And I know we didn't get into this, but there's also a powerful lesson in this for those that are faithful to God, that Moses was faithful. Moses had influence over God. I mean, he was able to. He had a faithful relationship with God, and because of that faithful relationship, he was able to convince God to curb his wrath against the Israelites. So I think it's a powerful example for us that if we are faithful, we can request things, faithful things of God, and God will listen to us. And there's an opportunity there to have some influence with God's decision.
The comment was that there's a lesson for people who are faithful to God, because Moses had a good enough relationship with God that he was able to convince God not to destroy the Israelites, which God had said, I will destroy the Israelites and make a nation out of you. He had a relationship that allowed him to change, in a sense, what God had indicated that he had intended to do, change his mind about it. And you see that in several other Old Testament characters that had that kind of relationship with God. Abraham bargained with God, if you can find 50 people in this city, will you not, 50 righteous people, will you not destroy it? Well, if I can find 45, will you not destroy it? And finally, if I can find 10, will you not destroy it? Abraham, had that kind of influence with God. There was one of the kings of Israel that God said, I think it was Hezekiah, that God said, "I'm going to take your life," and Hezekiah, I think it was Hezekiah, pleaded with him and said, pleaded with him not to, and basically said, "Okay, I'll let you live another 15 years." I believe it was 15, and so there were people, faithful people, who, in a sense, changed God's mind, or at least convinced him not to do what he said he was going to do. Bob?
Application, I think that's a great application. I think another one too from this that I get is that sometimes, and I think this is born out of the New Testament, the idea of enduring to the end and not being anxious because the Lord hasn't returned yet. I think it's one of those things where, encouraging people and God's children to remain faithful, even though it's been a long time, and waiting for God's promise to come, waiting for the Savior to come. For us, we can see in that lesson that whatever time it's been, we need to remain faithful despite the fact that we look forward to His return, we look forward to His coming, but like the Israelites, we need to be careful that we hold on to what God's will is, what His promises are, and hold on to that faith that He's going to see it through.
The comment was that this lesson actually is also, this incident is also actually a lesson for us to remain faithful in the sense that, Moses had been gone for 40 days, which was a lot longer than the Israelites expected him to be up on that mountain. And, Jesus hasn't come back today, and so it's kind of an encouragement. Well, it is an encouragement for us to remain faithful, even though things they're happening on God's time frame instead of ours. This is actually one of those examples that I mentioned. Sometimes you can look at a cause of somebody doing something, and it turns out to be that they weren't willing to wait on God, and this is one of those examples where that also is a cause of this. I'll ask one thing because I don't want to get into the next major example here, but are there things that you can think of that Aaron might have done that might have caused him to have second thoughts about what he was about to do? If you were in his situation, are there things that that could be done that might cause you to have second thoughts about making that calf? Okay. Dick said he could have reminded them how they came to be where they were at. All the people. Yeah. The comment was that the people wanted to go back to their comfort zone, so to speak. What they knew, what they had been comfortable with. One of the things that I think might have helped and might help us sometimes is trying to look at things from God's perspective. And sometimes there is a difference between trying to look at things from God's perspective and trying to look at what the Scripture teaches. And I want to try to clarify that some, because that's not going to sound right, but the Pharisees could take the Scriptures and come up with things and say, okay, this is what God wants. When Christ comes and And he looks at what they're doing and he says, no, you missed it. God said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever doesn't honor their father and mother is put to death. And he said, you say if they say that what I've got's a gift given to God, that he no longer has to honor his father and mother with it. And so, and you see also in Jesus' teaching, he's talking about the greatest commandments. Love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And the second one's likened to it, love your neighbor as yourself. There can be a difference sometimes between loving God and trying to pick apart the commandments in the Scripture. The Pharisees tried to make everything about an interpretation of the commandments without getting to know the God behind the commandments. And I don't know if I'm doing a very good job of saying what I'm trying to say, but there are times that you need to understand the God that's behind the Scriptures. And kind of a human example that I think of is when I was growing up, there were situations that I got into where my parents had, never told me, if you get in this situation, you do this. But I knew them well enough, in a lot of cases, if I found myself in a situation, I knew what they would want me to do. And now sometimes I missed it, but a lot of times I knew because I knew them. And I think sometimes we've got to obey the Scriptures, but sometimes we need to get to the point of saying, what is the God that's behind those Scriptures really like, and how would He want me to react? And we can't react contrary to Scriptures, but sometimes the focus needs to be on God and what God is like. I know the time's up, but I might, if somebody wants to rebut that or make some comments or something like that, then I'd welcome that too. Okay. Thank you.